Eliza Jane knew the language of silence better than any spoken tongue. It was the first thing she had learned and the last thing she was ever allowed to forget. Silence was the dust that settled on the furniture in Mr. Albright's mercantile, a fine gray powder that coated every surface of her life. Silence was the proper response to a sharp command, to a plate scraped clean, to the heavy, measuring tread of his boots on the floorboards above her cot in the larder. For 10 years, since the day the smoke cleared and she was pulled from the cinders of her family's small homestead, silence had been her shield and her cage. Her parents had not been silent people. She had faint, sun-bleached memories of her mother's laughter, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze, and her father's low, rumbling songs in Spanish as he mended tack. They had been killed by raiders, a fact stated to her once by Mr. Albright in a flat, dispassionate tone, as if reporting on the price of flour. He had taken her in, a thing for which the townspeople called him charitable, Eliza Jane, who polished his boots and emptied his chamber pot, knew it was not charity, it was business. She was an asset, a piece of property that did not require wages, only scraps from his table and a thin blanket against the chill of the border town nights. Fear was the air she breathed. It was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her days, a quiet companion that sharpened her hearing and taught her to walk without making a sound. She learned to read the tightening of Mr. Albright's jaw, the slight flare of his nostrils, the way his eyes would skim over her as if she were a column of figures to be tallied. He had never laid a hand on her in true anger, not in the way some men did. His cruelty was colder, a quiet and persistent erosion of her spirit. He kept her hungry enough to be grateful, tired enough to be compliant, and lonely enough to believe this was all she deserved. The arrangement was made on a blistering August afternoon. The air in the mercantile was thick with the smell of dried beans, oiled leather, and Mr. Albright's cheap cigars. A man stood before the counter, tall and broad, his face burned to the color of brick dust by a relentless sun. He was a cattleman, Mr. Sterling, who owned a ranch some 2 days' ride north, deep in territory that bordered the Apache lands. "She's a hard worker," Mr. Albright said, his voice smooth as poured molasses. He did not look at Eliza Jane, who stood by the sack of oats, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Obedient, never gives a lick of trouble." Mr. Sterling's gaze fell upon her. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky, and they held no warmth at all. They assessed her as he would a horse, noting her slim build, her calloused hands, her downcast eyes. She felt the weight of his stare like a physical touch, and she had to fight the urge to shrink further into the shadows. "My cook broke his leg," the rancher stated, his voice a gravelly rumble. "The men are complaining. I need someone to manage the cabin, keep the place clean. Through the winter, I'll pay you a fair price for her loan." The word hung in the air, loan, as if she were a shovel or a mule. Mr. Albright puffed on his cigar, a shrewd glint in his eye. "Winter can be hard up there, dangerous. It will have to be a very fair price." They haggled. Numbers were exchanged, figures that meant nothing to Eliza Jane. Her fate was being decided by 2 men who saw her as nothing more than a commodity. She had no voice, no say. To protest would be to invite a wrath she could not withstand. So she remained silent, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest, and waited for the transaction to be complete. An hour later, Mr. Albright counted a small stack of coins, his lips pursed in satisfaction. "She'll be ready in the morning," he declared. "Pack your things," he said, finally looking at her. It was not a request. Her things consisted of a single change of clothes and a small, worn wooden bird her father had carved for her. It was the only thing she had left of them. She wrapped it in her spare dress and placed it at the bottom of a rough burlap sack. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her cot, listening to the familiar sounds of the town shutting down, and felt a new kind of fear, sharp and cold. It was the fear of the unknown, a dread that coiled in her stomach like a snake. Here, at least, she knew the rules. She knew the dangers. Out there, in the wild lands, there would be new rules, new dangers, and no one at all to turn to. The journey was worse than she had imagined. She sat in the back of a supply wagon, perched atop barrels and crates, the sun beating down on her head. Mr. Sterling rode his horse up front, alongside two of his ranch hands. They were coarse, bearded men who spat tobacco juice and spoke in a language of grunts and curses. They ignored her completely, for which she was profoundly grateful. The wagon wheels churned up a constant cloud of fine, red dust that coated her skin, her clothes, her throat. Every bump and lurch of the wagon sent a jolt through her bones. The landscape was vast and terrifying. The familiar, dusty streets of her town gave way to an endless expanse of cracked earth, thorny scrub and distant, blue-shadowed mesas that shimmered in the heat. The sky was immense, a blinding sheet of blue that offered no comfort. It was a land that did not care for small, fragile things. It was a land that swallowed people whole. She clutched the sack in her lap. The little wooden bird, a secret, solid weight against her thigh. She thought of her parents, wondering if this was the kind of country they had tried to tame, the kind of country that had ultimately taken them from her. They made camp the first night under a sky spilling over with stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The men built a fire, and its crackling glow pushed back the immense darkness. The air grew cold quickly, a dry, biting chill that sank deep into her bones. The men passed a bottle of whiskey, and their voices grew louder, their laughter harsher. Eliza Jane sat apart, chewing on a piece of dry biscuit, making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. The sounds of the night were alien and menacing, the yip of a distant coyote, the mournful call of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures in the brush. She wrapped her thin shawl tighter and did not sleep, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames until they burned down to embers. They arrived at the ranch late the next day. It was not much more than a collection of rough-hewn wooden buildings huddled against the base of a rocky rise, a long, low bunkhouse for the men, a maze of corrals, a blacksmith's shed, and a main cabin that was larger than the others, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke into the twilight air. It was a place of stark function, built to withstand the elements, not to offer comfort. Mr. Sterling dismounted and gestured toward the main cabin with a jerk of his head. "That's your place. Jedediah is the foreman. He'll tell you what's what. Meals at sunup and sundown. Keep the place clean. Stay out of the men's way." He left her there, standing in the dusty yard with her burlap sack. A man emerged from the cabin, wiping his greasy hands on his trousers. He was leaner than the others, with a suspicious, squinting gaze and a mouth set in a permanent sneer. This was Jedediah. "You're the new girl," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Stove's in there. Water's from the well yonder. Provisions are in the pantry. Don't burn the biscuits and don't get underfoot." He looked her up and down once more, a dismissive curl to his lip, before turning and heading for the bunkhouse. There was no kindness in his words, no welcome. She was a tool, a replacement for a broken part. Eliza Jane took a deep breath, the dusty air scraping her lungs, and pushed open the heavy cabin door. The inside was a chaotic mess of male living. Dirty plates were stacked on a long trestle table. Muddy boots were caked to the floor. The air was stale with the smell of unwashed bodies, old wood smoke, and stale coffee. A small room off the main area held a simple cot with a lumpy mattress. This, she presumed, was hers. For a moment, the sheer filth and loneliness of the place threatened to overwhelm her. But then the years of training took over. She set down her sack, rolled up her sleeves, and began to work. To work was to survive. To work was to make herself useful. and to be useful was to be invisible. The days that followed fell into a grueling, monotonous rhythm. She rose before the sun, her breath fogging in the frigid morning air as she hauled buckets of water from the well. She stoked the fire in the great iron stove, cooked pans of bacon and beans, and brewed pot after pot of black, bitter coffee. The men would file in, their faces grim from the cold, and eat in a near-complete, noisy silence. Their only sounds the scraping of forks on tin plates. They were a dozen or so, a shifting collection of hard, weather-beaten faces. They rarely spoke to her, and when they did, it was to demand more coffee or complain about the food. She learned their faces, but not their names. There was the old one with a wheezing cough, the young one with nervous, darting eyes, the big one with a cruel laugh. They looked at her. She knew. When they thought she was not paying attention, she would feel their eyes on her back, on her hands as she washed the dishes, on her body as she bent to scrub the floor. Their stares were heavy and assessing, a mixture of crude curiosity and a casual contempt for her station, for her gender. She learned to keep her gaze fixed on her work, to build a wall of quiet diligence around herself. She moved through their space like a ghost, a silent, functioning part of the cabin they took for granted. The nights were the hardest. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to worm its way inside her. The cold was a living thing, seeping through the chinks in the logs. After cleaning up from the evening meal, she would retreat to her small room, but the thin walls offered little privacy from the men's loud talk and occasional bursts of drunken laughter in the main room. She would lie on her cot, curled into a tight ball for warmth, clutching the wooden bird in her hand, and listen to the wolves cry in the distant hills. Their calls were a stark reminder of how far she was from anything she had ever known, how utterly alone she was in this vast, unforgiving wilderness. She was a prisoner of the coming winter, trapped in this crude cabin with a dozen strange, rough men. The supply of firewood she kept in a box by the hearth was dwindling faster than she expected. The nights grew colder with each passing day, and the men kept the fire roaring. One evening, after the last of the cowboys had shuffled off to the bunkhouse, leaving her with a mountain of greasy dishes, she realized the wood box was nearly empty. There was a small pile stacked against the outside wall of the cabin, but Jedediah had warned her not to venture out after dark. "Too many things out there that bite," he had grunted. But the thought of the fire dying in the night, of waking to a cabin colder than a tomb, was more immediate than the fear of some unseen predator. The wind had died down, and a fragile, slivered moon cast a pale, ghostly light over the hard-packed earth of the yard. It was quiet, terribly quiet. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and slipped out the door. The cold hit her instantly, sharp as a needle. She moved quickly, her worn boots making soft scuffing sounds in the dirt. The woodpile was just around the corner, a dark, jagged shape in the gloom. She began to gather splintery logs in her arms, her fingers already growing numb. The wood was heavy, awkward. She could only carry a few pieces at a time. She was on her third trip, her arms laden, when a sense of unease washed over her. It was a primal feeling, the deep-seated instinct of prey. She stopped, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. She was not alone. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her head and scanned the deep shadows near the edge of the corral, some 20 yards away. A man was standing there. He was perfectly still, a tall silhouette against the darkness, watching her. He was not one of the ranch hands. She would have recognized the shape of him, the slump of his shoulders. This man stood differently, straighter, with a stillness that was both patient and menacing. The moonlight caught the high line of his cheekbones and the dark gleam of long, black hair. He wore buckskin, not denim, and he made no sound at all. An Apache, the word screamed through her mind, All the stories she had ever heard, the whispered warnings in town, the terrifying tales of savage raids and unspeakable violence, coalesced into a single, paralyzing wave of terror. The raiders who had burned her home, who had left her an orphan in a cruel world, they had been Apache. Her mind showed her fire and smoke, heard the echoes of screams she had long tried to bury. The logs tumbled from her arms, crashing to the ground with a sound that seemed deafening in the immense silence. She could not breathe. Her blood ran cold, turning to ice in her veins. He did not move. He just watched her, his face an unreadable mask in the shadows. To her terrified mind, his silence was not patience. It was the predatory stillness of a wolf before it strikes. He was going to hurt her. He was going to kill her. The certainty of it was absolute, a cold, hard fact that settled in the pit of her stomach. And in that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, a strange clarity pierced through the panic. Her entire life had been a lesson in endurance, in accepting the inevitable. She had learned long ago that fighting back only made the pain worse, made it last longer. There was no escape. He was too far. She was too slow. Screaming would do no good. The bunkhouse was too distant. And who there would risk their life for a hired maid? All she had left was the desperate, pathetic hope of a swift end. Her voice, when it came, was not a scream, but a broken, trembling whisper, barely more than a breath of frosted air. "Please," she breathed, the word tearing from her raw throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to bear the sight of him any longer. "Make it quick." The words hung in the frigid air between them, a final, desperate plea from a soul that had known nothing but hardship and expected nothing but violence. For a long moment, there was no response. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing. Then, she heard a faint sound, the soft crunch of a boot in the dirt. He was coming. This was it. She opened her eyes, bracing for the final, brutal impact, but he was not moving toward her. He had taken a single, reflexive step back. His posture had changed. The stillness was gone, replaced by a visible tension. Even from a distance, she could see the shock that registered on his face. He froze, his head tilted slightly, as if he could not comprehend the words she had spoken. He stared at her, not with menace, but with a look of profound, disturbed confusion. Her terror-filled plea had not been the response he expected. He held her gaze for another second, his expression unreadable in the shifting moonlight. Then, without a word, he turned and melted back into the shadows from which he had emerged. He was simply gone, as silent in his departure as he had been in his arrival. Eliza Jane stood there, trembling so violently she thought her knees would buckle. The cold air burned in her lungs. She was alone again, but the terror did not recede. It was replaced by a wave of crushing shame. The man was gone. He had not hurt her. He had done nothing but stand there, and she had offered up her life to him like a sacrificial lamb. She had shown him the broken, terrified thing she was. She scrambled to gather the fallen logs, her hands shaking too badly to get a firm grip. Finally, with a clumsy, overflowing armful, she stumbled back into the cabin and bolted the heavy wooden door behind her. She dropped the wood into the box with a clatter and sank to the floor before the hearth. The embers glowed a dull, angry red. She stared into them, her face hot with humiliation, her body still shivering with cold and fear. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, whistling a low, lonesome tune through the cracks in the walls. It sounded like the world weeping, or maybe it was just the echo of the wolves, calling out across the vast, dark, and merciless land. Eliza Jane pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, and curled into the smallest ball she could manage, haunted by the stranger's shocked face and the sound of her own pathetic whisper in the unforgiving winter air. The following morning, Eliza Jane woke to a cold that felt sharp enough to cut glass. Her shame from the night before was a physical weight, a sour taste in her mouth. Every chore was an exercise in dread. When she stepped outside to fetch water, her eyes scanned the shadows, half expecting to see him there again, watching her with that same disturbed expression. But the yard was empty, still and frozen under a sky the color of slate. She moved with a hurried, furtive energy, her gaze fixed on the ground, terrified of meeting anyone's eyes. She was scrubbing the long trestle table after the men's silent, wolfish breakfast when she saw it. Through the grimy window pane, she noticed something by the cabin's woodpile. It was a neat stack of freshly cut logs, far more than she could have gathered, laid crisscross to keep them from rolling. Beside the wood, hanging from a low branch of the lone, skeletal juniper tree, were 2 skinned rabbits, clean and ready for the pot. She stopped her work, the wet rag dripping onto the floorboards. She stared, her heart giving a slow, heavy thump against her ribs. No one had done it. None of the ranch hands would bother with such a task for her. They barely managed their own chores without Jedediah's barking commands. It could only have been one person, the silent man from the darkness, the Apache tracker. A knot of confusion tightened in her stomach. She went to the door and opened it a crack. Peering out, the offering was real. The raw meat looked dark against the pale winter landscape. This was not the act of a monster. Monsters took. They did not give. Mr. Albright had never given her anything without first calculating its return. The men of the ranch never offered help. Only heavy-lidded stares that made her skin crawl. This was something else entirely, something for which she had no frame of reference. It was a gesture without a demand attached, and it frightened her more than a direct threat would have. She quickly shut the door, her mind racing. She did not retrieve the wood or the rabbits until long after the men had ridden out, her movements swift and guilty, as if she were receiving stolen goods. The rabbit stew she made that night was richer than any meal she had cooked before, but every bite tasted of confusion and a strange, unfamiliar gratitude. His name, she learned, was Taza. She heard it spoken for the first time by Jedediah, spat out like a curse. "Taza says a storm's coming from the north," the foreman announced to the room one evening, his tone thick with disdain. "Says he can smell it. I say he smells of last week's whiskey." The men around the table chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of easy agreement. Eliza Jane, clearing the plates, glanced toward the corner where the tracker always sat. He was not there. He never ate with the others. He would appear at sundown, speak a few quiet words to Mr. Sterling or the foreman about the state of the fences or the movement of the herd, and then vanish again into the twilight. He had his own place, a small, 3-sided lean-to tucked away behind the barn, as separate from the bunkhouse as it was possible to be. Over the next few days, a silent language began to form between them. It was a language of objects and spaces, of things left and things found. One morning, she found the path to the well cleared of the sharp stones that always seemed to catch the hem of her dress. Another time, a handful of late-season piñon nuts were left on the porch railing where she shook out the morning rugs. For her part, she began to leave a tin mug of hot, sweetened coffee on that same railing just after sunrise. She never saw him take it, but when she returned an hour later, the mug was always empty. These small, wordless exchanges became the focal point of her days. They were a secret thread of connection in a life defined by isolation. She began to watch him, not with fear, but with a cautious, consuming curiosity. She saw him from the cabin window as he worked with the horses. His movements were fluid and economical, a stark contrast to the rough, jerky handling of the other men. He had a way with the animals, a quiet patience that seemed to calm even the most skittish colt. He moved through the harsh landscape as if he were a part of it, his step silent, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading a language in the clouds and the dirt that she could not comprehend. She saw his strength, not just in the lean muscle of his arms as he hoisted a saddle, but in his stillness. He could stand for an eternity. It seemed watching the horizon, perfectly calm, perfectly self-contained. But most of all, she saw his loneliness. It was a palpable thing. A cloak he wore as surely as his buckskin jacket. The other men treated him as a necessary tool, a creature with a useful skill who was otherwise less than human. They spoke to him only when they needed him to track a lost steer or predict the weather. They never shared a joke with him, never offered him a cup of their whiskey around the fire. He walked among them, but he was utterly alone, an island in a sea of their contempt. His isolation was a mirror to her own, and a strange, painful empathy began to take root in her heart. The men's talk was a constant, ugly current running beneath the surface of ranch life. She would hear it as she served their meals, her face a carefully blank mask. "Can't trust his kind," one of the older hands muttered one night, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Smile at you in the morning, scalp you in your sleep." "Sterling pays him too much. You ask me," another added. "For what? Sniffing at the ground like a dog?" Jedediah was the worst. His prejudice was a sharp, venomous thing. "Half of him is white," he'd said with a sneer, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "And it's the worst half, got all the white man's greed and none of his sense. The other half is just plain savage." Eliza Jane would lower her head, her knuckles white as she gripped a stack of dirty plates. The words were like stones, and she felt the bruises they left on the air. She knew they were talking about Taza, but the slurs felt personal, a reminder that she, too, was an outsider, her own heritage a mark against her in their eyes. She was a servant, a woman, a Mexican. She was different, and different was always dangerous. The tension on the ranch finally snapped one bitter cold afternoon. A young, boastful cowboy named Caleb came stomping into the cabin, his face flushed with fury. "It's gone!" he shouted, slamming his fist on the table so hard the tin plates jumped. "My Winchester! It's gone!" A commotion erupted as men filtered in from the yard, drawn by the noise. Jedediah pushed his way to the front, his eyes narrow and suspicious. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean it ain't where I left it," Caleb said, his voice cracking with a mixture of anger and panic. "I put it on the pegs in the bunkhouse this morning. Now it's gone. Someone took it." Jedediah's eyes immediately swept the room and then settled on the open doorway. His gaze was cold and certain. "Where's the tracker?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "He rode out an hour ago," someone supplied, "checking the north fence line. And now a rifle is missing," Jedediah said, letting the implication hang in the air. "Funny how that works." The accusation was immediate and absolute. No one questioned it. No one suggested another possibility. In their minds, there was only one person on the ranch capable of such a theft. Suspicion fell on Taza as naturally as snow fell on the mountains. Proof was an unnecessary complication. Eliza Jane's blood ran cold. A wave of nausea washed over her. Because she knew Taza was innocent the day before, while shaking a heavy blanket out behind the cabin. She had seen Caleb sneak into the barn. He had been carrying the rifle. A few minutes later, another ranch hand, a man named Silas, with whom Caleb was always gambling, had slipped into the barn after him. When Silas came out, he was empty-handed, but he had a strange, smug look on his face. She hadn't understood it at the time, but now it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Caleb had likely lost the rifle in a card game or to settle a debt, too cowardly to admit it. He had concocted a story, and Taza was the perfect scapegoat. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She should speak. She should tell them what she saw. A single sentence from her could change everything. She opened her mouth, the words forming on her tongue. But then she saw the look on Jedediah's face. It was a look of cold, predatory satisfaction. He wanted this. He wanted Taza to be guilty, and she saw the faces of the other men. Hard and unforgiving, already convinced. What was her word against theirs? She was just the maid, the Mexican girl. They would not believe her. They would accuse her of lying, of protecting the tracker. Jedediah's wrath would turn on her, and there would be no one to protect her. The fear that had been her lifelong companion rose up and choked the words in her throat. Her survival instinct, honed over 10 years of silent obedience, screamed at her to stay quiet, to make herself invisible. And so she did. She lowered her head, turned back to the sink, and said nothing. The weight of her silence was immediate and crushing, a physical sickness in the pit of her stomach. Taza returned at dusk, riding his steady paint horse into the yard. He was met not by quiet indifference, but by a wall of hostile men, with Jedediah at their head. Eliza Jane watched from the window, her hands trembling. "Where's the rifle?" "Taza?" Jedediah demanded, his voice carrying on the crisp evening air. Taza swung down from his horse, his movements unhurried. He looked at the foreman, then at the circle of angry faces. "What rifle?" he asked, his voice calm. "Do not play dumb with me," Jedediah snarled. "Caleb's Winchester. It went missing right after you rode out." Taza's expression did not change, but a flicker of understanding, of weary resignation, passed through his dark eyes. "I have no rifle but my own," he said simply. "Search his things," Jedediah ordered. 2 men stomped over to the lean-to and tore through his meager belongings. A bedroll, a small leather pouch, a spare shirt. They found nothing, but the lack of proof did not deter them. It only made them angrier. "He probably stashed it out on the range," Caleb insisted, his voice high-pitched. "He's a thief!" "He needs to be taught a lesson," Jedediah said, his voice filled with a chilling authority. Mr. Sterling was away, visiting a neighboring ranch, which left Jedediah in charge. He was judge, jury, and executioner. "A lesson about what we do with thieves on this ranch. Tie him to the post." Eliza Jane clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a cry. This could not be happening. It was a nightmare. She wanted to scream, to run out there and tell them the truth, but her feet were rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed by terror. They dragged him to the thick hitching post in the center of the corral. Taza did not fight them. He walked with a stiff, proud dignity that seemed to infuriate them even more. They tore his shirt from his back and tied his wrists to the post above his head. His bare back was a canvas of taut muscle and old, faint scars in the dying light. Jedediah uncoiled a long leather whip. The sound it made as it cut through the air was a vicious hiss. Eliza Jane could not watch, but she could not look away. She shrank back from the window and fled to the barn, hiding in the dusty shadows, peering through a wide crack between 2 of the boards. The first blow landed with a sickening crack. Taza's whole body jerked, but he made no sound. Another followed, and another. Jedediah laid into the task with a cruel, methodical rhythm. Eliza Jane squeezed her eyes shut, but the sound was inescapable, the wet, slapping impact of leather on skin. Jedediah's heavy breathing, the quiet, encouraging grunts from the assembled men, and through it all, the terrible, defiant silence of the man at the post. He did not cry out. He did not beg. He took the punishment with a stoicism that was both heartbreaking and magnificent. She pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the barn wall, hot tears of shame and horror streaming down her face. Each crack of the whip felt like a lash against her own conscience. This was her fault. Her silence had allowed this to happen. She was a coward, just as weak and pathetic as she had been that night in the yard when she had whispered for him to make it quick. He was being beaten for a crime he did not commit, and she was hiding in the dark, a silent party to the injustice. When it was over, they cut him down. He crumpled to his knees for a moment before pushing himself slowly, painfully, back to his feet, without a word or a look at any of them. He walked, stiff and unsteady, toward his lean-to and disappeared inside. The men dispersed, their grim work done, their cruel justice served. That night, the cabin was suffocating. Eliza Jane moved through the motions of cleaning up, her body numb, her mind screaming. The men ate their dinner, their conversation subdued, but with an undercurrent of grim satisfaction. She could not look at them. She could not bear the sight of Caleb, who ate his food with a sullen, guilty expression, refusing to meet anyone's eye. Long after the cabin was quiet and the men were in their bunks, she lay on her cot, staring into the darkness. Sleep was impossible. The only thing she could hear was the sound of the whip. The only thing she could see was Taza's silent, bleeding back. Her guilt was a living thing, clawing at her insides. She could not take back her silence, but she could not do nothing. Driven by an impulse stronger than her fear, she rose from her cot. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. In the pantry, she found a tin of salve used for burns and saddle sores. From her own meager belonging, she took her spare chemise, a thin but clean cotton garment, and tore it into strips. She filled a tin cup with fresh water from the bucket. Her heart pounded in her chest as she unlatched the cabin door and slipped out into the freezing night. The sliver of moon offered little light. The world was a place of deep shadows and sharp, cold stars. Every rustle of the wind sounded like an approaching footstep. She scurried across the yard, keeping to the darkest shadows. Her breath held tight in her chest. The lean-to was little more than a dark shape against the deeper darkness of the barn. There was no light inside. She paused at the opening, her courage failing her. What if he sent her away? What if he hated her for her silence? He had every right. Taking a shuddering breath, she stepped inside. It was small and smelled of leather, dust, and the clean, wild scent that clung to him. He was sitting on his bedroll, his back to her. He did not turn as she entered, but she knew he was aware of her. His whole body was rigid with pain and watchfulness. She could not find her voice. Instead, she knelt beside him and placed the cup of water, the strips of cloth, and the tin of salve on the ground. He still did not move. For a long, agonizing moment, she thought he would ignore her completely. Then, slowly, he turned his head. His face was a mask of exhaustion and pain in the gloom, his eyes dark pools of suffering. He looked at the items on the ground, then back at her. His gaze was unreadable. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Relief and shame warred inside her. It was an acceptance, but not an absolution. As she prepared to retreat, to slip back into the night, her hand moved on its own. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and gently touched his hand where it rested on his knee. It was not his bloodied back she touched, but his strong, calloused hand. His skin was warm. The contact sent a jolt through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a simple, solid warmth, the warmth of a living, breathing person who was hurting. His fingers twitched slightly beneath hers, but he did not pull away. And in that quiet, shared touch, something inside her shifted. For the first time in his presence, she felt no fear, only a profound, aching sorrow and the fragile, tentative beginning of a connection that went deeper than words. The storm Taza had predicted arrived not as a gentle dusting of snow, but as a furious, white-toothed monster. It descended from the northern plains without warning, a solid wall of wind and blinding snow that erased the horizon and swallowed the world whole. Within an hour, the ranch was an isolated island in a roiling sea of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, clawing at the cabin, forcing fine powder through every crack and crevice. The world shrank to the four walls of the main room, the glowing eye of the hearth, and the suffocating presence of a dozen men trapped with their own sour tempers. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of gray light and howling darkness. Tempers, already frayed thin by the hard life of the range, began to unravel completely. Arguments broke out over card games, accusations of cheating slung like knives across the table. Men bickered over the last dregs of coffee, complaining about the dwindling portions of salted pork and beans Eliza Jane carefully rationed out. The air in the cabin grew thick and stale with the smell of unwashed bodies, frustration, and a potent, simmering boredom that threatened to boil over into violence. Mr. Sterling, the owner, was a grim, silent presence, his jaw perpetually tight as he watched his supplies and his men's morale dwindle in equal measure. Jedediah, the foreman, grew more volatile with each passing day. He paced the cabin like a caged wolf, his eyes landing on Taza with a specific, venomous dislike. Taza's correct prediction about the storm had not earned him any respect. On the contrary, it seemed to deepen their suspicion of him, as if he were somehow in league with the malevolent forces of nature. Taza, for his part, remained impassive. He kept to himself, a silent figure by the hearth, mending a piece of tack or simply staring into the flames, his stillness a stark reproach to the nervous energy that consumed the other men. The crucial, life-sustaining chores of hauling water from the well and keeping the wood boxes full became a point of contention. The short journey from the cabin door to the well, or the wood pile, was a battle against the elements, a brutal gauntlet of blinding snow and flesh-biting wind. The men shirked the duty, offering a litany of excuses until, on the 4th day of their confinement, Jedediah's patience finally snapped. "Enough!" he roared, his voice cutting through the grumbling. He pointed a long, bony finger at Taza. You're not doing anything but taking up space. You'll fetch the wood." Then his cold eyes swiveled and landed on Eliza Jane. "And you'll haul the water? The both of you. You're the only two on this ranch not worth a damn in a card game, so you might as well make yourselves useful." The order was a punishment, a deliberate pairing of the two outcasts. It was meant to demean them both. Eliza Jane's heart sank, but she kept her face carefully blank, nodding her head in silent compliance. A strange mixture of dread and a faint, unbidden flicker of something else, not quite relief but a lessening of tension, settled in her chest. Being out in the storm with a silent tracker seemed infinitely preferable to being trapped inside with Jedediah's simmering rage. Their first trip together was a study in silence. They bundled themselves against the cold, Eliza Jane wrapping her thinnest shawl over her head, and Taza pulling the collar of his sheepskin coat high. The moment they stepped outside, the wind tore at them, stealing their breath. They moved through a world of pure white, the other buildings of the ranch reduced to faint, ghostly shapes. Taza went first, his tall frame breaking the worst of the wind, his long, sure strides creating a path for her to follow in the deepening snow. He did not speak, and neither did she. They worked with a grim, shared efficiency, he loading her arms with firewood, she filling her buckets at the well, the squeal of the pulley a lonely cry in the vast, howling silence. This became their routine. Twice a day, they would venture into the white fury, their shared labor a silent conversation. The world outside the cabin became their sanctuary. In the swirling chaos of the blizzard, there were no prying eyes, no sneering remarks, no heavy, assessing stares. There was only the wind, the snow, and the simple, urgent reality of the task at hand. The silence between them was no longer awkward or heavy with unspoken fear. It was a comfortable, shared space. It was Taza who broke it. They were in the lee of the barn, taking a moment's respite from the wind, the snow swirling around the corners of the building. "The bucket is heavy," he said. His voice was a low rumble, almost lost in the wind. "Let me." Eliza Jane, her arms aching from the weight of the water, was startled. She looked up at him. His face was chapped by the cold, snowflakes clinging to his dark eyelashes. "I can manage," she said, her own voice thin and reedy. He did not argue. He simply took one of the two buckets from her hand. The sudden relief from the weight was so profound her arm tingled. He carried it alongside his own load of firewood, and they walked back to the cabin. The simple gesture spoke more than a dozen sentences. From that day on, the words came more easily. Small offerings dropped into the vast silence, short, clipped observations about the weather. "More snow tonight," A quiet warning. Ice, there. A shared acknowledgement of their world. The wind is turning. One afternoon, sheltered in the barn as the storm reached a new peak of fury, the conversation deepened. They sat on a pile of sweet-smelling hay, the air thick with the warm, earthy scent of animals. Taza was staring out through a crack in the boards, watching the snow dance and spin in the wind. "My mother," he said, his voice quiet and distant. "She used to say the snow was the ghosts of fallen warriors, searching for their way home." The unexpected confidence took Eliza Jane by surprise. She had never heard him speak of his family. She remained silent, sensing that any interruption would shatter the fragile moment. "She was Apache," he continued, his gaze still fixed on the storm. "She knew this land. She taught me how to read it, how to listen to what the wind says, how to find water where there is none." He paused, and a shadow of profound pain crossed his features. "The cavalry came. They said her people had raided a settlement. It was a lie, but they did not care about the truth. They burned our camp. She was killed." He said it plainly, a flat statement of a fact that had cleaved his world in two. "My father," Taza went on, his voice hardening slightly. "He was a white man, a trapper. He found me after. He took me with him for a time, but he had no place for a half-breed boy. He looked at me and saw her. He looked at me and saw a memory he wanted to forget. He left me at a trading post when I was 10, told me he would be back in a week." Taza finally turned his head and looked at her, his dark eyes holding a lifetime of disillusionment. That was 20 years ago. He was a man caught between two worlds and belonging to neither. Hated by the whites for the blood of his mother, and an outcast from his mother's people because of the blood of his father. Eliza Jane felt a powerful, aching empathy for him. His loneliness was a wound as deep and raw as her own. His story unlatched something in her. As he shared his brokenness, she felt the first urge to share her own. "Mr. Albright," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "The merchant who raised me, he keeps a ledger for his accounts." She looked down at her own chapped, work-worn hands. "I think he sees me as an entry in that book, a small asset. He tells people he saved me, but he did not save me. He acquired me." She told him of the constant, quiet hunger, the cold larder where she slept, the way he would loan her out for extra profit, as he had done with Mr. Sterling. "I am a possession," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Something to be used until it is used up. I have no people. I have no place. I am just his." Taza listened, his expression intent. He did not offer pity or empty words of comfort. He simply listened, and in his listening, she felt seen. She felt, for the first time in a decade, that she was more than just a silent, obedient maid. She was a person with a story, a person with pain, and he was another. They were two solitary figures, adrift in a harsh world, who had just found a shared and desolate shore. A week into the storm, a new crisis arose. The supply of salted meat in the cabin's pantry was gone. There was more. "Mr." Sterling announced, in a small, stone-walled smokehouse about 100 yards from the main buildings. But no one was willing to venture out in the blizzard's peak. "Taza can find it," the ranch owner said, his decision final. "I will go, too," Eliza Jane said, her voice small but firm. "I know what is needed." Jedediah scoffed. "But Mr." Sterling nodded. The two of them, the outcasts, were once again dispatched to do the work the others refused. They set out with a rope tied between them, a precaution against being separated in the whiteout. The wind was a physical force, pushing and pulling, the snow so thick she could barely see Taza, a dark shape just a few feet ahead of her. The cold was brutal, sinking its teeth deep into her bones. They reached the smokehouse, a dark smudge in the swirling gray, and Taza forced the frozen door open. Inside, It was dark and smelled of hickory smoke and cured meat. They worked quickly, loading a burlap sack with hams and bacon. On the way back, disaster struck. They had to cross a small, shallow creek bed that was usually dry but had been filled with meltwater before the freeze. A thick layer of snow now disguised its surface. Eliza Jane, her feet numb and clumsy, misstepped. There was a sickening crack of ice, and then she was plunging into black, shockingly cold water up to her waist. The cold was a stunning, violent blow. It stole the air from her lungs in a single, painful gasp. It was not just cold, it was a liquid fire that burned her skin and seemed to stop her heart. She cried out, a strangled, terrified sound. Instantly, Taza was there. He hauled on the rope, pulling her out of the creek's grip and onto the snowy bank in one powerful movement. Her wet skirts were already stiffening, freezing solid. The 100-yard walk back to the cabin might as well have been 100 miles. She was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. Taza did not hesitate. He scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice tight with urgency. He began to run, his long legs churning through the deep snow, carrying her back toward the faint, distant light of the cabin. He burst through the door and carried her not to the main room, but straight to her small, curtained-off alcove. He laid her on the cot. Her body was racked with violent, uncontrollable shudders. Her mind was a fog of cold and panic. "The dress," he said, his voice taut. "It must come off. Now." A new wave of terror, entirely different from the cold, washed over her. She had spent her life guarding herself, making herself small and invisible to avoid the kind of attention that led to this. To be undressed by a man was the ultimate violation, the thing she had feared above all else. She tried to protest, to push him away, but her limbs would not obey. Taza saw the fear in her eyes. His own face was grim, his jaw set. "Eliza Jane," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You will die if you stay in these clothes." He worked with a detached, clinical urgency. His fingers were surprisingly deft as he unfastened the tiny, frozen buttons of her bodice. He was not rough, but he was not gentle either. He was efficient. He pulled the sodden, icy dress from her body, then the wet chemise beneath it. She was laid bare, exposed to the cold air and to his gaze. A profound, soul-deep shame washed over her, so intense it momentarily eclipsed the cold. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, for the cruel touch, for the violation that her life had taught her was inevitable. But it never came. Instead, she felt the rough, dry warmth of a wool blanket being wrapped tightly around her. He stripped the furs from his own bedroll and piled them on top of her. But she was still shaking, her skin like ice, the cold coming from deep within her bones. He knew it was not enough. He hesitated for only a second. Then, he lay down on the narrow cot beside her, pulling the mountain of furs over both of them. He gathered her into his arms, pressing her shivering body against the solid, living heat of his own. His embrace was not threatening. It was firm, protective, and utterly impersonal. He was a furnace, and she was a block of ice he was trying to melt. Slowly, agonizingly, the warmth began to seep into her. The violent shudders began to subside into smaller tremors, and as the immediate threat of freezing to death receded, the emotional dam inside her broke. A single, hot tear escaped her closed eyelid. Then another. Soon, she was sobbing, a deep, silent, racking crying that shook her entire frame. It was not a cry of fear or of cold. It was a cry of profound, terrible vulnerability, a release of 10 years of terror, of being seen and touched and not harmed, of being cared for when she had only ever known servitude. Taza held her, his arms a circle of warmth in the cold, lonely world. He let her cry, his hand resting steady and warm on her back. When the worst of the sobs had passed, he spoke, his voice a low whisper near her ear. "You are not broken," he said gently. The words pierced through her grief. She took a shaky breath, the air catching in her throat. She thought of the pieces of herself she had hidden away, the parts of her spirit that had been chipped away by a decade of cruelty and neglect. "But I am not whole, either," she whispered back, the admission a raw and painful truth. He shifted slightly, and she opened her eyes. His face was inches from hers in the dim light of the alcove. His dark eyes were filled with a deep, shared understanding. He saw the broken pieces in her because he was made of them, too. Slowly, he leaned in. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of passion or of lust. It was hesitant, trembling, and as raw as an open wound. It tasted of the cold, of shared pain, and of the unsaid things that lay between them. It was the kiss of two broken people finding a moment of wholeness in each other, a fragile spark of warmth in the heart of an endless storm. The thaw came slowly, a reluctant loosening of winter's grip. The blizzard broke, leaving behind a world remade in pristine, silent white. The sun, a pale disk in a washed-out sky, cast long blue shadows across the snow-drowned landscape. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere changed. The oppressive, claustrophobic tension of confinement gave way to the familiar routines of ranch life. But something between Eliza Jane and Taza had been irrevocably altered. Their shared secret was a living thing, a fragile warmth they nurtured in the cold, hostile environment. They moved through their days in a state of heightened awareness, their lives governed by a new, unspoken language. A brief meeting of their eyes across the crowded dinner table could convey a question and an answer. The slight inclination of his head as he passed her in the yard was a greeting meant only for her. When she left a piece of cornbread wrapped in a cloth on the porch railing, she knew he would find it. When she found a small, perfectly carved feather made of pine wood on her windowsill, she knew it was from him. These were the bricks and mortar of their hidden world. Small, secret kindnesses that built a fortress around the two of them. Their true conversations happened in the deep of night, in the sheltering dark of the barn. After the last of the men had stumbled off to the bunkhouse and the main cabin was quiet, Eliza Jane would slip out, a ghost in the moonlight, and make her way to their sanctuary. Taza would be waiting for her in the hayloft, a dark silhouette against the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the roof. Here, surrounded by the warm, sweet scent of hay and the soft sounds of sleeping animals, they could talk. Their bond was not one of easy laughter or light-hearted stories. It was forged in the sharing of scars. She spoke of the endless, grinding humiliation of her life with a Mr. Albright, of the hollowness inside her that a decade of being treated as less than human had carved out. He spoke of the bitter loneliness of walking between two worlds, rejected by both, of the constant need to prove his worth in a land that saw his heritage as a threat. They were two halves of a single, sorrowful song, and in the quiet of the barn, they found a harmony that existed nowhere else. It was during one of these hushed meetings that a new, dangerous seed began to sprout in Eliza Jane's mind. It was a thought so audacious, so foreign to her years of resigned survival, that it terrified her. "What if we left?" she whispered into the darkness, the words feeling clumsy and strange on her tongue. Taza, who was sitting beside her, turned his head. "Left?" "Away from here," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Away from them, from Mr. Albright, from all of it. There is so much land out there. We could find a piece of it, a place where no one knows us, where they would not look at you and see a savage, or at me and see a servant." It was a child's dream, a fantasy spun from desperation. But as she spoke the words aloud, they took on a fragile, shimmering possibility. A small cabin, a plot of land for a garden, a life where they did not have to hide, where they did not have to be afraid, a life that was their own. Taza was silent for a long time. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the gloom. He saw the desperate hope there, a flickering candle she was trying to shield from the wind. He did not tell her it was impossible. He did not list the dangers, the prejudices that would follow them wherever they went. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. The solid, warm reality of his touch was his only answer. It was not a promise, but it was enough to keep the small flame of her dream alive. As the snow melted and the land turned to a sea of mud, the other men on the ranch began to notice. It was nothing they could prove, nothing they could put a finger on, but the dynamic had shifted. The silent, invisible Maid was no longer quite so invisible. The sullen, solitary tracker seemed to have a new, quiet purpose in his gaze. The mockery, which had always been a low undercurrent, grew louder and more pointed. Jedediah and Caleb were the ringleaders. Caleb, still smarting from the humiliation of the stolen rifle incident, seemed to take a special, cruel pleasure in tormenting her. "Getting friendly with Sterling's pet Indian, are you?" he drawled one evening as she refilled his coffee cup, his voice loud enough for the entire table to hear. Eliza Jane flinched but said nothing, her face burning with shame as the other men snickered. "Got a taste for buckskin, have you?" another man chimed in, grinning. Their words were like sharp, dirty little stones, and they threw them at her whenever they could. They bumped into her in the narrow confines of the cabin, their touches lingering just a moment too long. They made crude jokes about what a woman might do to pass the time during a long winter. She built her wall of silence higher, retreating further into herself, her only solace the promise of those stolen moments in the barn. She saw the quiet fury that gathered in Taza's eyes when he heard them, the way his jaw would tighten and his hands would clench into fists. She would give him a small, pleading shake of her head, begging him with her eyes not to react, not to make things worse. The inevitable explosion came on a raw, wind-swept afternoon. Eliza Jane had taken a pile of horse blankets to the barn to mend. The main cabin felt suffocating, and the quiet solitude of the barn was a welcome respite. She sat on a low stool in a patch of weak sunlight, the rhythmic push and pull of the needle a small, soothing comfort. She did not hear him approach. The barn door creaked open and then slammed shut, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. Caleb stood there, blocking the only exit, a twisted, ugly smirk on his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice oozing a false friendliness that made her blood run cold. "Look what we have here, all alone." Eliza Jane's heart began to hammer against her ribs. She slowly got to her feet, the horse blanket sliding to the floor. "I have work to do," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Oh, I am sure you do," he said, taking a slow step toward her. He reeked of cheap whiskey. "Lots of work. Keeping the men happy. Keeping that half-breed happy." "Please," she said, backing away until she felt the rough wood of a horse stall against her back. "Leave me be." "Why should I?" he sneered, closing the distance between them. "He gets to have you. Why should not I? I am a white man. I am better than him." He reached for her, his hand grabbing her arm in a painful, bruising grip. The old, familiar terror seized her, cold and paralyzing. Her throat closed up, and she could not scream. This was it, the thing she had feared her entire life. Her body went rigid, her mind retreating to that silent, numb place where it went to endure the unendurable. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them, a blur of motion. Caleb was ripped away from her with such force that he stumbled and fell to the ground. Taza stood over him, his face a mask of cold, lethal fury unlike anything she had ever seen. He had moved without a sound, a specter of vengeance emerging from the shadows. Caleb scrambled backward, his bravado vanishing in a wave of pure fear. "I was just talking to her," he stammered. Taza did not speak. He descended on Caleb like a hawk on a rabbit. The first punch was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The second sent Caleb's head snapping back against the dirt floor. Taza fell on him, his hands closing around Caleb's throat, his thumbs pressing deep into his windpipe. A terrible, guttural rage poured out of him. the culmination of a lifetime of slurs, of injustices, of being treated as less than a man. He was going to kill him. Caleb's face turned a mottled purple. His legs thrashed weakly. "Taza!" Eliza Jane's voice was a raw scream. It broke through her paralysis. She scrambled forward and grabbed his arm, pulling with all her might. "Taza, stop! Please! You will kill him!" For a moment, he did not seem to hear her. He was lost in the red haze of his rage. "Please," she sobbed, her fingers digging into his buckskin sleeve. Do not do this. For me." Her voice, her touch, finally pierced through his fury. He blinked, his focus shifting from the man beneath him to the woman beside him. He looked at her tear-streaked, terrified face, and the madness in his eyes receded, replaced by a dawning horror at what he had been about to do. He released his grip. Caleb collapsed, gasping and choking, a broken, sobbing mess on the barn floor. Taza rose slowly to his feet, his chest heaving. He looked down at his own trembling hands, then at Eliza Jane. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the barn, disappearing into the gray afternoon. Mr. Sterling returned from a cattle auction 2 days later. He was a man who valued order and profit above all else, and he returned to a ranch buzzing with rumors and discontent. Jedediah and a bruised and swollen Caleb were quick to give him their version of events. The savage tracker had tried to murder one of his men in a jealous rage over the little Mexican maid who had been tempting them all winter. Eliza Jane was summoned to the main cabin that evening. The other men were sent away. It was just her and Mr. Sterling. He sat at the head of the long table, his face hard and impassive as a stone carving. "I provide you with a roof and food," he began, his voice low and cold. "In return, you are to do your work and cause no trouble. Do you understand what trouble is, girl?" She stood before him, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Yes, sir." "It seems you do not," he said, rising from his chair. "You have been a disruption. You have been a temptation to my men. You have turned them against each other. A good woman, a proper woman, knows her place. She is modest and quiet. You, it seems, are not." The injustice of it stole her breath. She had done nothing but try to survive. She was being blamed for Caleb's brutishness, for Taza's reaction, for the ugliness that had been here long before she arrived. "That is not true," she whispered, the words of protest escaping before she could stop them. His eyes narrowed. "Are you calling me a liar?" He moved around the table until he was standing in front of her. He was a big man, and he loomed over her, a mountain of righteous, masculine authority. "I will teach you your place. I will teach you the price of causing trouble on my ranch." He hit her. It was not a whip, but the flat of his hand against her face, a single, brutal blow that sent her staggering backward. Her head snapped to the side, and a universe of stars exploded behind her eyes. The side of her face went numb, then began to burn with a searing pain. "You are here to work," he said, his voice a low growl. "You are not here to entice men or cause fights. You are property, my property, on loan from Mr. Albright, and I will handle my property as I see fit." He struck her again, on the other side. This time she fell, landing hard on the rough floorboards. She curled into a ball, her arms covering her head, and waited for the next blow, but it did not come. He stood over her for a moment, his breathing heavy. "Clean yourself up," he said, his voice filled with disgust. "And if I hear one more word about you and that Apache, I will send you back to Albright in pieces." He turned and left the cabin, his heavy boots echoing on the floor. Eliza Jane lay there for a long time, the pain in her face a dull throb, but the pain in her soul a sharp, piercing agony. He was right. She was property. She was nothing. The tiny, fragile dream of a life with Taza, of a place of their own, shattered into a million pieces. She eventually pulled herself up and stumbled to her small, dark room. She sank onto the cot, the sobs she had held back now shaking her entire body. She cried for the pain, for the injustice, for the brokenness of a world that saw her as a thing to be used and discarded. She did not know how long she had been crying when she felt a presence in the room. She looked up. Taza was standing in the doorway, a silent shadow against the dim light from the main room. His face was grim, his eyes burning with a helpless fury. He came to her and knelt on the floor before her cot. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently touched her bruised cheek. His touch was as soft as a whisper. The anger in his eyes was for her and for what had been done to her. He held her then, gathering her up from the cot and into his arms, holding her as she cried. He did not offer empty words or false promises. He just held her, a solid, warm presence in the wreckage of her world. When her tears finally subsided, he leaned back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away the last of her tears. He looked into her eyes, and his gaze was fierce, a solemn vow. "You are not theirs," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not his property. You do not belong to them." The words were a balm on her wounded spirit. He was refuting the core truth of her existence, the lies she had been forced to live for 10 years. In his eyes, she was not a thing. She was a person. She was his equal. That night, as a soft, silent snow began to fall outside the cabin window, dusting the world in a fresh layer of white, their shared pain and desperation overflowed. He kissed her, and this time it was not the hesitant, questioning kiss of the blizzard. It was a kiss of profound, desperate need, a claiming and a surrender all at once. It was a fierce declaration against the cruelty of the world, a desperate attempt to find a moment of grace in a place that had none. Their lovemaking was a slow, gentle exploration, an act of healing. It was desperate and tender, a quiet conversation spoken in the language of touch, in the small, dark room, with the snow falling like a curtain against the window. They created a sanctuary. For a few short hours, they were not the half-breed tracker and the servant girl. They were just a man and a woman, finding solace and a fragile, fleeting beauty in each other's arms. The next morning, Eliza Jane woke to the pale gray light of dawn filtering into her room. For a blissful, unguarded moment, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. She turned, expecting to see Taza beside her, but the other side of the cot was empty and cold. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She dressed quickly and went into the main room. It was empty. The men were already out. She went to the door and looked out at the ranch. Taza was nowhere to be seen. His horse was gone from the corral. She waited, all day. She performed her chores in a fog of growing dread. Every time a rider appeared on the horizon, her heart would leap, only to sink again when she saw it was not him. The men ignored her, their silence heavy with smug condemnation. They believed they had won. They had driven the tracker away and put the maid back in her place. Doubt began to creep into her heart, a cold and poisonous thing. Had he left? Had he abandoned her? Had the events of the last few days been too much? Had he decided that she was, in fact, nothing but trouble? The long, silent day was a special kind of torture, her hope slowly bleeding away with each passing hour. Night fell. She served the men their dinner in a state of numb misery. After they left, she sat alone by the hearth, staring into the dying embers, the silence of the cabin a deafening roar in her ears. He was not coming back. She was alone again. She must have dozed off, because she was awoken by a smell, acrid and sharp. Smoke. At the same time, a strange, flickering orange light began to dance outside the window. She jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. The smell was stronger now, thick and choking. She ran to the door and threw it open. The front of the bunkhouse was on fire. Flames licked up the dry wooden walls, casting a terrifying, demonic glow across the ranch yard. But it was not the fire that made her blood run cold. It was the group of men on horseback, silhouetted against the flames. There were a half-dozen of them, armed with rifles and carrying torches. At their head was Caleb, his face swollen and distorted with hate. They were not here just to set a fire. They were a lynch mob. They had come back for Taza. In that instant, all her fear, all her doubt, was burned away by a single, clarifying purpose. Taza had not abandoned her. He had likely seen them coming and ridden out to lead them away from the ranch. Away from her. And now they were hunting him. Eliza Jane did not hesitate. She was no longer the frightened girl who whispered for a quick end. She was no longer the silent maid who hid from confrontation. The woman Taza had held, the woman he had told was not a piece of property, would not hide while he was being hunted. She turned from the fire, her eyes scanning the darkness. Smoke was beginning to fill the cabin, but she ignored it. She had to get out. She had to find him. She had to stop them, with a fierce, desperate resolve. She slipped out the back of the burning cabin and ran, a lone, determined figure disappearing into the cold, unforgiving night. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of snow and frozen pine needles. Eliza Jane ran, her lungs burning with every ragged gasp of icy air. The smoke from the burning ranch a bitter taste in the back of her throat. The sounds of the mob were a discordant symphony behind her. Drunken shouts, the baying of a hound, the crashing of horses through the undergrowth. They were hunting him. The thought was a shard of glass in her heart. He had ridden out to protect her, to lead them away, and now he was the quarry. She did not run aimlessly. Taza had taught her things in their brief, stolen moments. He had shown her how to read the bend of a branch, the faint impression of a hoof in the snow. She followed the trail, a desperate prayer on her lips, her own small tracks swallowed by the larger, more violent path of his pursuers. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds grew louder, coalescing in a small clearing ahead. A hellish orange glow filtered through the skeletal trees. She crept forward, her stomach a cold, tight knot of dread, and peered through a thicket of firs. They had him. The sight stole the breath from her body. Taza was bound to a massive ponderosa pine, his arms stretched taut above his head by a thick rope that cut into his wrists. His shirt was torn, his face bruised and bleeding from a fresh cut on his cheekbone, but he stood tall, his head unbowed. He stared at his captors with a silent, burning contempt that was more defiant than any shout. Caleb stood before him, swaggering, his face a swollen mask of triumphant hatred. The other men, their faces lit by the flickering, greasy light of torches and a roaring bonfire, passed a bottle of whiskey, their laughter sharp and cruel in the frozen night. "Look at him now," Caleb slurred, jabbing a finger at Taza's chest. "Not so tough without the girl to hide behind. We'll let you watch the sun come up. Apache, it will be the last thing you see before you swing." Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Eliza Jane. There were too many of them. She was one small woman with nothing but her bare hands. They were armed, drunk, and consumed by a bloodlust she could not fight, but she could not run. She could not leave him. There was only one other hope, a desperate, long shot of a chance. Fort Grant. The army fort was a half-day's ride away. They were the law in this territory, the only authority that might stand against a lynch mob. Decision solidified into action. She backed away from the clearing as silently as she had come, her mind racing. She needed a horse. Returning to the ranch was a risk, but it was the only way. She circled wide, her path a long, looping arc that brought her to the back of the corrals, far from the burning bunkhouse. Most of the horses were gone, taken by the mob, but one old mare, overlooked in their haste, stood shivering in a corner. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the latch on the gate, her movements clumsy with urgency. There was no time for a saddle or bridle. She grabbed a fistful of the horse's coarse mane, whispered a soothing word into its ear, and hauled herself onto its bare, bony back. The ride was a nightmare of cold and fear. She urged the old mare into a clumsy, jarring gallop, clinging to its neck as it stumbled through the dark, snow-dusted forest. The wind tore at her thin dress, her skin burning with the cold. She rode not toward the familiar trail south, but northeast, toward the distant promise of federal authority. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig sounded like a pursuing rider. She pushed the horse, and herself, past the point of exhaustion, driven by the image of Taza tied to that tree, his life measured by the slow turning of the earth toward dawn. She reached the fort just as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky. It was a formidable structure, a neat, orderly square of log walls and buildings, a world away from the chaotic squalor of the ranch. A sentry, his breath pluming in the cold, challenged her at the gate, his rifle held at the ready. "I need help," she gasped, sliding from the horse's back, her legs buckling beneath her. "There is a mob. They are going to hang a man." The soldier's face was young, impassive, his eyes betraying no emotion. He called for his superior, a sergeant with a thick mustache and tired, cynical eyes, who emerged from the guardhouse, pulling on his coat. Eliza Jane poured out the story, her words tumbling over one another in her desperation. She told him about the fire, about Caleb and the other men, about Taza tied to a tree, waiting for sunrise. The sergeant listened, his expression unchanging. When she was finished, he looked her up and down, taking in her disheveled state, her simple maid's dress, her frantic, pleading eyes. "What is this man's name?" he asked, his voice flat. "Taza," she said. The sergeant's eyes flickered with a cold, dismissive understanding. "The tracker from Sterling's ranch, the half Apache." "Yes," she said, a new dread coiling in her gut. "But he has done nothing wrong. They are going to murder him." The sergeant sighed, a weary, impatient sound. "Ma'am, what happens between a bunch of ranch hands and an Apache tracker is not official army business. It is a local dispute." "But it is murder," she cried, her voice cracking. "You are the law here." "The law," he said, his voice hardening, "is a complicated thing out here. We have treaties to uphold and hostiles to worry about. We do not have the time or the men to go chasing after every squabble over a stolen rifle or a pretty face." He glanced at her, and the implication was clear. "You are the maid from the ranch, are you not?" "Yes, but what does that matter?" "It matters because you are just a maid," he said with brutal finality. "And he is just an Apache. Now, I suggest you get on your horse and ride back before you get yourself into more trouble than you are already in. We can do nothing for you." He turned and walked back into the warmth of the guardhouse, leaving her standing in the bitter cold, his words a wall of ice she could not break through. She was nothing. He was nothing. Their lives did not matter. Her last hope died in the gray, unforgiving light of dawn. She did not weep. The despair was too deep for tears. A cold, hard resolve settled in its place. If the law would not help, then she would be the law. If the world would not save him, then she would. She pulled herself back onto the exhausted mare and turned it back toward the forest, toward the clearing where a man's life was hanging by a thread. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon when she neared the clearing, its first rays filtering through the pines in long, golden shafts. She tethered the horse a safe distance away and crept forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The mob was stirring. The men were shaking off their drunken stupor, their mood ugly and impatient in the morning light. Caleb was coiling a new, thicker rope, a noose already tied at one end. "Time is up, savage!" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Time to pay your due?" Eliza Jane knew she had only moments. She looked for a distraction, anything to draw their attention. Her eyes landed on a small pile of rocks near her hiding place. With a shaking hand, she picked one up and hurled it as far as she could into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing. It crashed through the undergrowth with a loud crackle. "What was that?" one of the men asked, jerking his head up. "Probably just a deer," Caleb scoffed. But he and two others moved toward the sound, their rifles raised, peering into the shadows. It was the only chance she would get. She took the small, sharp skinning knife that Taza had given her to cut twine, its edge honed to a razor sharpness, and slipped from her hiding place. She moved like a shadow, keeping low, using the trees and the bonfire for cover. The remaining men were watching their friends, their backs to the tree where Taza was tied. She reached the great pine, her breath held tight in her chest. Taza's eyes, which had been fixed on his tormentors, flickered and found hers. She saw no surprise in them, only a deep, weary recognition. He gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent warning for her to save herself. She ignored it. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the knife. She began to saw at the thick rope above his head. The fibers were tough, resistant. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was too thick, that she would not be able to cut through it in time. "They are coming back," she heard a man shout. Panic gave her a surge of adrenaline. She put all her weight into the knife, her knuckles scraping raw against the rough bark of the tree. A strand popped, then another, with a final, desperate sob of effort. The rope gave way. Taza's arms fell, and he stumbled forward, his legs weak from standing for so long. She grabbed his hand. "Run!" she whispered, her voice a raw croak. They plunged into the forest just as a shout of alarm went up from the clearing. They ran, fueled by desperation, crashing through the brush, ignoring the branches that tore at their clothes and skin. A gunshot cracked behind them, the bullet whining past her ear. They did not look back. They ran until their lungs were on fire and their legs were screaming in protest. Taza, weakened and wounded, began to falter. He leaned heavily on her, his breathing harsh and ragged. They were hunted, wounded, and half-frozen. The sounds of pursuit were still behind them, closer than she dared to think. They needed to hide. Just ahead, tucked into the side of a rocky escarpment, was a dark opening, almost completely hidden by a thicket of overgrown juniper, an old miner's cave. Taza had pointed it out to her once on a walk. "In here," he rasped, pushing her toward it. They scrambled inside, collapsing into the damp, earthy darkness. The cave was not deep, just a shallow hollow in the rock, but it was shelter. It was concealment. They huddled together at the very back, listening as the sounds of the mob grew closer, then, blessedly, passed their hiding place and continued on. For a long time, they did not move, their ragged breaths the only sound in the cold, silent dark. When the last echo of the hunters had faded, Eliza Jane finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She began to shake, not from the cold, but from the aftermath of terror. The light that filtered into the cave was dim, but it was enough to see by. Taza was in a bad way. The rope had rubbed his wrists raw and bleeding. The cut on his face had stopped bleeding but was now swollen and purple. He had other bruises on his chest and arms from the struggle of his capture. Both of them were worn, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, their clothes torn. She tore a strip from the hem of her already ruined dress and gently began to clean the wound on his cheek. He winced but sat perfectly still, his eyes closed. She worked in silence, her movements tender, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. They were alive, for now, but they were trapped, with nowhere to go, and the mob would eventually realize they had missed them and circle back. The odds of their survival were impossibly slim. The thought of their imminent deaths was a cold, hard certainty. She looked at his bruised, exhausted face, and a wave of profound sorrow washed over her. They had found each other, two broken souls in a merciless world, only to have it all torn away. "If we die tonight," she whispered, her voice trembling in the stillness of the cave. "At least I was yours once." Taza opened his eyes. He looked at her, and his gaze was filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He slowly lifted his hand, the one she had not yet bandaged, and cupped her cheek. He was too weak to kiss her lips. Instead, he brought her hand to his mouth and gently kissed her knuckles. "You still are," he murmured, his voice a low, rough whisper that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. They huddled together for warmth as the morning wore on, drifting in and out of an exhausted sleep. It was the sound of a horse that woke them. A single horse, approaching slowly. They tensed. Their brief respite shattered. It was over. They had been found. A figure appeared in the mouth of the cave, silhouetted against the bright morning light. It was one of the younger cowboys from the ranch, a boy named Billy, who was usually quiet and kept to himself. He held a rifle, but it was pointed at the ground. His face was pale and troubled. "I saw the fire," he said, his voice quiet. "I followed them. What Caleb said, it did not sit right. He lost that rifle in a card game. I knew it. I was just too scared to say anything." He looked from Taza's bruised face to Eliza Jane's torn dress, and his expression hardened with shame and resolve. "This is wrong, all of it." He had not come to hurt them. He had come to help. "They will be back," Billy said, his voice urgent. "They are searching the whole area. You cannot stay here, but I know a way. There is a wagon train of Mexican settlers moving west. They crossed the river yesterday. They are camped about 5 miles from here. They will not ask questions. If you can make it there, you might have a chance." Hope, something Eliza Jane thought she had lost forever, flickered back to life. Billy gave them his canteen of water and a piece of dried beef from his saddlebag. He helped the weakened Taza to his feet and led them through a series of winding, little-known game trails, his eyes constantly scanning, his ears tuned for any sound of pursuit. They reached the crest of a ridge and looked down into a small, sheltered valley. A dozen canvas-topped wagons were circled around several small campfires. The sight of them, the promise of safety and anonymity, was so overwhelming that Eliza Jane felt her knees go weak. "This is as far as I go," Billy said. "Tell them you are husband and wife, heading for California. They are good people. They will help you." He looked at Taza, his young face filled with a difficult, newfound respect. "I am sorry," he said. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, a lone figure of conscience disappearing back into the wilderness. Eliza Jane and Taza made their way down into the camp. They were greeted with cautious but not unfriendly stares. An older man with a kind, weathered face, the wagon master, listened to their story of being a married couple who had lost their horse and belongings to bandits. He offered them food and a place by the fire without question. For the next few weeks, they traveled with the settlers, slowly putting distance between themselves and the life they had fled. They spoke little of what had happened, the trauma still too raw. They settled into their roles as a married couple, the fiction a strange comfort. They shared a blanket at night under the vast, star-filled desert sky. They found a fragile, temporary peace in the slow, rhythmic movement of the wagon train. In the simple, shared tasks of the day, they found shelter for a while in the high desert hills, a land of stark, sun-baked beauty, so different from the cold, dark forests they had escaped. But the past was never far away. One evening, as Eliza Jane sat by the communal fire, she watched a young girl, no more than 10 years old, helping her father mend a piece of harness. The girl, Elena, was quiet and withdrawn, with large, haunted eyes that reminded Eliza Jane of herself. As the girl reached for a tool, the sleeve of her dress slipped, revealing a pattern of dark, ugly bruises on her small forearm, marks that were too distinct to be accidental. Eliza Jane froze, the tin cup in her hand suddenly heavy. She saw the shape of a man's fingers in the discoloration. She saw the fear in the girl's eyes as she quickly pulled her sleeve back down, glancing nervously at her father. In that moment, Eliza Jane was no longer in the warm circle of the campfire. She was back in Mr. Albright's cold mercantile, a small, silent girl, learning to hide her own bruises, her own pain. She remembered her own silence, the silence that had protected her abuser. She remembered her silence at the ranch when Taza was accused, the silence that had nearly cost him his life. A profound and terrible clarity washed over her. She had spent her entire life believing that silence was a shield, a way to survive, but it was not. Silence was a cage. It protected the guilty and allowed the wicked to flourish. Silence had not protected her, and it was not protecting this little girl. In that moment, watching the child flinch from her own father's shadow, Eliza Jane knew that she could not be silent ever again. The sight of the bruises on little Elena's arm was a brand on Eliza Jane's memory. For 2 days, she watched, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She saw the way the girl flinched when her father, a burly, sour-faced man named Samuel, moved too quickly. She saw the way Elena's eyes, too old for her young face, would dart around, constantly assessing for a threat. She saw her own childhood reflected in the girl's silent, watchful fear, and the reflection was unbearable. The silence she had once mistaken for a shield now felt like a co-conspirator's gag. She chose her moment carefully. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the camp. Most of the settlers were occupied with their chores. Samuel was repairing a broken wagon wheel, and he sent Elena to the supply wagon for a tool. Eliza Jane followed, her steps quiet but deliberate. She found the girl inside the dim, canvas-covered wagon, her small hands fumbling with a heavy wrench. "Elena," Eliza Jane said, her voice soft. The girl jumped, dropping the tool with a clatter. Fear flashed in her eyes before she recognized who it was. Eliza Jane knelt, bringing herself down to the child's level. She did not reach for the girl's arm. She did not need to see the bruises again. They were etched in her mind. "No one has the right to hurt you," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a lifetime of unshed tears. "Not ever. It is not your fault." Elena stared at her, her lower lip trembling. She said nothing, but a single, large tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. At that moment, a shadow fell over the wagon's opening. "What is going on here?" Samuel's voice was a low, suspicious growl. He looked from Eliza Jane's earnest face to his daughter's tear-streaked one, and his expression darkened with fury. "Get back to the wheel," he snarled at Elena. The girl scurried past him, her head bowed. Samuel turned his full attention on Eliza Jane, his large frame blocking the light. "You stay away from my daughter," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "What goes on in my family is my business. You are an outsider. You have no say." The Eliza Jane from the ranch, the girl from Mr. Albright's mercantile, would have shrunk back. She would have lowered her eyes and murmured an apology, but that girl was gone, burned away in the fire of the lynch mob and reforged in the quiet desperation of the miner's cave. "When a child is being harmed," Eliza Jane said, her own voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart, "it becomes everyone's business." His face contorted with rage. It was the shock of being challenged, the fury of a bully whose power was being questioned by someone he considered beneath him. "You little meddling stray," he hissed, and his hands shot out, grabbing her arm in a punishing grip, the same way Caleb had done in the barn. "I will teach you to mind your own affairs." He began to drag her from the wagon, his fingers digging into her flesh. But before he could pull her into the open, a hand, hard as iron, clamped down on his shoulder. Taza stood behind him, his face as still and dangerous as a thundercloud. He had appeared without a sound, a silent guardian who was always there when she needed him. "Let her go," Taza said. His voice was not loud, but it held a deadly quiet that was more terrifying than any shout. Samuel, blinded by his rage, tried to shake him off. "This is none of your concern. Apache," he spat. Taza's grip tightened. With a single, fluid movement, he spun Samuel around and slammed him against the side of the wagon, The wood groaned under the impact. Taza did not hit him. He did not choke him. He simply pinned him there, his forearm pressed against Samuel's throat, his body a wall of immovable strength. His eyes burned with a cold, controlled fire. It was not the wild rage he had unleashed on Caleb. It was the focused, deadly intent of a man protecting what was his. "Everything that concerns her," Taza said, his voice low and lethal, "concerns me." The commotion had drawn the attention of the camp. People began to gather, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The wagon master, an old man named Mateo with wise, steady eyes, pushed his way to the front. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Samuel, his face red and his breathing labored under Taza's hold, began to shout. "This savage attacked me, for no reason, and this woman, she was interfering with my daughter, filling her head with lies." This time, Eliza Jane did not stay silent. She stepped forward into the circle of settlers, her arm throbbing where Samuel had grabbed it, but her voice clear and strong. "He is lying," she said, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the women in the crowd. "He hurts his daughter. I have seen the bruises on her arms. Elena is afraid of him." She looked at Mateo. "I know what it is to be a child who is afraid, and I know what it is to have no one to speak for you." A murmur went through the crowd. Several of the women exchanged knowing glances. They had seen the girl's sadness, her withdrawn nature. Eliza Jane's words gave voice to their own unspoken concerns. Mateo's gaze sharpened. He looked from Eliza Jane's resolute face to Samuel's sputtering denials. "Elena," he called out, his voice gentle but firm. "Come here, little one." The girl crept forward from behind another wagon, her eyes wide with fear. She looked at her father, then at Eliza Jane. Mateo knelt, just as Eliza Jane had done. "Is it true, child?" he asked softly. "Does your father hurt you?" Elena's entire body trembled. For a long, agonizing moment, she was silent, her gaze fixed on the ground. Then, she took a shaky breath and gave a single, tiny nod. It was all the confirmation the community needed. A wave of anger and disgust rippled through the settlers. Samuel's blustering defense crumbled into pathetic silence. This was not a mob of drunken ranch hands. This was a community of families, bound together by the shared hardships of the trail, whose first and most sacred duty was the protection of their children. The justice they delivered was not swift and bloody, but it was absolute. Mateo stood, his face a mask of grim authority. Taza released Samuel, who stumbled back, his eyes darting around at the wall of hostile faces that surrounded him. "You are no longer welcome here," Mateo said, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "We do not abide men who raise a hand to a child. You will take one horse, a day's supply of water, and your rifle. You will ride east. If we ever see your face again, we will not be so merciful." He turned to one of the other men. "See to it. Elena would be cared for by another family, a couple who had lost their own child to fever years before. Samuel was cast out, an exile, his crime judged and punished not by a formal law, but by the simple, unbending moral code of the community. For the first time, Eliza Jane saw justice that was not a tool of the powerful, but a shield for the weak. That night, the mood around the campfire was subdued but filled with a new sense of solidarity. Taza sat at the edge of the firelight, sharpening his knife, a silent, watchful presence. Eliza Jane sat with the women, a cup of warm tea cradled in her hands. She could feel their gazes on her, filled with a new respect. She was no longer just the quiet outsider they had taken in. She was the woman who had spoken truth to power, who had dared to break the silence. One of the older women, Maria, whose own daughter was now caring for Elena, reached out and placed a warm hand on her arm. "That took great courage, what you did today," she said, her voice filled with kindness. "You have a strong spirit." Eliza Jane looked into the dancing flames, the firelight warming her face. And for the first time in her life, she felt safe enough to share the full weight of her story. "My spirit was not always so strong," she began, her voice a low murmur that drew the other women closer. "For a long time, I did not think I had one at all." She told them everything. She spoke of her parents, of the fire and the smoke, of being taken in by Mr. Albright. She spoke of the 10 years of silent servitude, of being treated like a piece of furniture, an entry in a ledger. She spoke of the cold, the hunger, the gnawing loneliness. She told them of the ranch, of the crude stares and crueler words of the men. She spoke of the whipping, and of her own cowardly silence. She did not cry. Her voice was steady, a simple recitation of the facts that had formed the cage of her life. Then she spoke of Taza. "There was a man there," she said, and her gaze drifted to the shadows where he sat. "They called him a savage. They treated him like an animal, but he was the only one who saw that I was a person. He brought me firewood when I was cold. He carried me when I fell. He held me when I was afraid. They hurt him, they beat him, and they tried to kill him. But he never, not once, tried to hurt me. He saw all the broken pieces of me, and he did not turn away." Across the fire, Taza stopped his work. He had been listening. His head bowed. He slowly lifted his face, and in the flickering firelight, Eliza Jane saw the glint of tears in his eyes. He was not crying for his own pain, but for hers, and for the strength it had taken for her to finally give that pain a voice. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, transform from a survivor into a warrior. A few weeks later, the wagon train reached the great, churning expanse of the Colorado River. This was where their paths would diverge. The settlers were heading south, into the established territories of New Mexico. For Eliza Jane and Taza, the future lay west, across the river, in the wild, empty lands that stretched toward the setting sun. The parting was one of genuine sadness and gratitude. The settlers gave them supplies: a sack of flour, beans, a sturdy axe, and 2 blankets. Mateo pressed a small leather pouch of coins into Taza's hand. "For a new start," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. Elena, her eyes no longer haunted, her smile now quick and bright, threw her arms around Eliza Jane's waist in a fierce hug. "Thank you," the girl whispered. "You saved me." The words struck Eliza Jane with the force of a physical blow. Saved her. All her life, she had been a victim, a servant, a possession. She had never thought of herself as someone capable of saving anyone. But as she held the small girl, she finally understood. Her voice, her courage, had made a difference. She was not defined by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to do. In that moment, holding the child she had protected, she finally believed she was more than what the world had tried to make her. They crossed the river on a makeshift raft, their few possessions bundled between them. On the far side, a new world awaited. It was a vast, rugged country of red rock canyons, sprawling mesas, and a sky so wide and blue it felt like a benediction. It was unclaimed, untamed, and unforgiving. It was a place where a man and a woman could disappear, a place where they could build a life on their own terms, far from the judgments and prejudices of the world they had left behind. They found their spot in a small, sheltered valley, where a clear stream cut through a grove of cottonwood trees. Taza, with the patient, methodical skill that defined him, began to build. He felled trees, hewed logs, and raised the walls of a small, sturdy cabin, a shelter against the wind and the world. Eliza Jane worked alongside him, chinking the logs with mud and straw, her hands growing calloused, her body strong. She cleared a small patch of earth near the stream, turning the soil, her fingers sinking into the cool, dark promise of the land. She planted the first seeds: corn, squash, and beans, the small, hard kernels, a prayer for a future she had never dared to imagine. Their life was hard, but it was their own, their past. However, did not simply vanish. It lingered, a ghost that haunted the edges of their new life. Some nights, Taza would wake with a choked cry, his hands clutching at his throat, his mind reliving the tightening of the noose in the pre-dawn light. Eliza Jane would hold him, her voice a soothing murmur, her touch a steady anchor to the present, until the terror receded. Other nights, she would jolt awake, her face stinging with the phantom pain of Mr. Sterling's blow, the word property echoing in her ears. Taza would pull her close, his solid presence a silent rebuttal to the old lies, and hold her until she fell back into a peaceful sleep. They faced their demons together, and in doing so, they robbed them of their power. One evening, as the last of the sun's fire bled across the horizon, they sat on the porch of their newly finished cabin. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the cottonwoods. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a perfect, peaceful moment, the kind of quiet beauty she had never known existed. Taza had his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, her body fitting against his as if it had been made to be there. She thought back to that first night she had seen him, a terrifying silhouette in the darkness. She remembered the sheer, animal terror, the whispered, pathetic plea for a quick end to her suffering. She had wanted her life to be over. Now, sitting here, in this place they had built with their own hands, with this man whose quiet strength was her rock, she wanted nothing more than for life to stretch on forever. She curled into his arms, turning her face up to his. The scars on his face and the lines of hardship around his eyes were a map of the life that had led him to her. She traced the line of his jaw with her finger, her heart overflowing with a love that was deeper and truer than anything she could have imagined. "Please," she whispered, her voice soft in the growing twilight, a conscious echo of that first, terrified plea. He looked down at her, a question in his eyes. "Do not make anything quick," she said, her voice catching with emotion. "I want every second." A slow, gentle smile touched his lips. He leaned down and kissed her, a long, deep kiss that was full of unspoken promises and shared yesterdays, a kiss that sealed the foundation of their new world. He held her through the night as the stars emerged, a brilliant, silent scattering of diamonds across the velvet sky. Their love, born from the crucible of pain, prejudice, and blood, was no longer a fragile, hidden thing. It was real. It was strong. And here, at last, in the heart of the wild, it was finally safe. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.